Tēnā koutou katoa, Selwyn Manning, and welcome to this episode of A View from Afar. And in this episode, political scientist and former Pentagon analyst Paul Buchanan and we're going to deep dive into what Paul has titled here, The End of the Liberal Internationalist Order and, this is a significant part, the rise of IL-Libertarianism. So we're going to deep dive into these topics here. A global transition process. What is exactly this and why is this happening? Also, why is conflict used as a global systems regulator and agent of change? And what does this mean for 2026? The United States, it's clear, has been the core of two pillars of liberal internationalism, and Paul will speak to these points. Its security system and its system of trade. But then why has the United States decided to break that very system it has benefited from for decades, if not over a century? The risk of advancing its own demise. Why would it do that? So we're going to deep dive into that. But before we do kick off this episode, first, remember, as always, if you're joining us via the social media platforms, feel free to comment, as we can include your comments and questions in this program. But remember, we have a preference here, and we encourage you to join us via YouTube, as on YouTube, live interaction is especially efficient with our system here. So with all that said and done, let's cross to Paul, who's waiting online to discuss these issues and more. So we'll just cross to Paul here now. Kia ora, Paul. Tēnā koe iho.
Yeah, tēnā koe. Selwyn, it's good to see you again as we move into winter down here, down under. But at least we're far from the fray. I think what we should do is do two brief parts to the intro and then get into the meat of the discussion. Those parts are the long transition that has now reached its apogee, if you will, or its climax, and then discuss the demise of the liberal international order and the rise of a illiberal order.
Yeah, it's a hard one to say that. I slowed right down. I've got this tendency to speak too fast, when I'm introducing things. And I had to slow right down on that word just to make sure I didn't kind of get tongue-tied on. What I like about this, Paul, and what you've sketched out here is all of us, we're well aware of the breaking news, the chaos. Every day there's a new thing happening. Much of it is disturbing. Much of it challenges all of us who have watched the world affairs and our own lives over, decades now. And so what I like about this is it gives a context to what's happening. And it's far too easy sometimes very, very justified, but it's too easy to point to, say, Donald Trump and say he's the cause of this problem. And in some ways, what you're doing here, it seems to me, is making sense of the environment around that allows people like Trump to rise to the top and become leaders. So when we see day-to-day things happening, I think this places a context so that people can see what you see when you're witnessing events on the world stage as we are at the moment. So back to you. I just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because, we've already discussed the fact that you and I, we're not going to do the war porn and the weapons fetishism that we see all too often in the corporate media. But I also feel bad for our American friends because the coverage from the likes of CNN and Fox, the spin is heavy. And they're not dealing with the reality that we see from a distance. That's why this show is called A View from Afar. I find myself going, surely they cannot believe what they're saying. Like, among other things, that they're winning. That somehow the United States is prevailing. But more importantly, the short-termism, the immediatism of Western media coverage is truly astounding, given that they churn out journalism students, by the dozens,
Mm.
It's like, gosh, you guys, not only are you doing laundry lists of weapons and body counts and stuff, but you're barely beyond your noses to look at the bigger picture. And by both personality and by background and training, I tend to drift towards the bigger picture. And in this case, it's what's next.
Mm.
So, having said that, I would say I would preface again the meat of the matter by the following. You and I, this show's been on now, I think, 6 years. And then, of course, you and I have an association that goes back to the printed word way back
Mm.
when. Um, we have talked for a very long time about what, I'll call the long transition. And the long transition was first from the bipolar world of the Cold War to the unipolar world where the United States dominated, and it was called the hegemon in a gross misuse of the term by international relations theorists. And then, as of 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq, we're seeing the emergence of first a multipolar constellation, but now it's moving to a polycentric international order. And the key there is that these are times of tremendous uncertainty because there are ascendant powers and descendant powers. There are new actors, there's declining actors. So it's a bit of a jumble. And the default option in a anarchic system, right, because the things broke down, is conflict. Conflict becomes the system's regulator. Conflict comes in many guises. It can be economic, it can be diplomatic, it can be cultural, religious, and of course, military. And sure enough, as the years have gone on, and then with the precipitant or the catalyst that is Donald Trump's entrance into the international scene, we have reached the point today where a military conflict is the straw that broke the camel's back when it comes to the old liberal international order. So we're on the cusp of something different, and it's coming soon. It won't consolidate soon. This new order will take a while, but I'll preface my remarks by simply saying the United States will not dominate it. And so let me get to the meat of the matter uh, by briefly starting out with the U.S., for all the spin, has lost this war. It's done. It's all over, as they say, but the shouting.
How
And
do
it
you
may have
measure
some,
that? How do you measure that, the win or the loss? It's a
well,
binary thing,
that's
isn't it?
a good point because you measure it against the larger backdrop of the liberal internationalist order. And so let
Okay.
me let me go to that because that's where you'll see
Mm.
the uh, so the liberal international order started out as a theoretical strand in international relations theory um, that said basically the combination of free markets and free societies was the best thing for the global community. Free markets basically meaning capitalism, and free societies basically meaning democracy, but we'll call it electoral democracy. Now, it never achieved universal granting of free societies. I mean, to be honest, during the Cold War and after, Western democracies were happy to trade with dictatorships. In fact, the United States in particular supported uh, very nasty dictatorships so long as they were pro-U.S., pro-capitalist, and were willing to curry the United States favor in places like the UN. And I'm thinking particularly from my personal background, the dictatorships of Latin America of the 1960s, 70s, 80s. All virulent regimes grotesque in their human rights violations, but friends with the United States. So everything
We
was
talked
good.
about polycentrism, polycentric relationships last episode, didn't we? And how trade, we saw evidence of this, but that is changing, then we talked in depth about how other nations, in particular in the global south, forming relationships where it's outside of trade, that where it suits a person, they can pivot to one thing on one point. So in some ways, we can see from the relationships that the United States has entered into in past decades, there's a degree of that has occurred, and it might not have been to the advantage of the peoples of those states and nations, particularly in the South America, Southeast Asia, where ideological wars had occurred. But getting back to your point, it's a really interesting one in this episode because it's taking that backdrop further. And if people are wondering what we're talking about in the polycentric elements of it, just perhaps have a look and a listen to last month's episode, because it lays this ground out really well for where Paul is. I just wanted to bring that for
Okay,
those
well,
that didn't see it.
thanks for that. So let's continue. So what we know is that whatever liberal internationalism was in theory, it wasn't exactly that in practice. But what it was in practice was it stood the system, which includes institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the EU, the modern international institutional edifice, if you will, dominated by the North, dominated by the West, under the pretext of democracy and markets. Well, in reality, what liberal internationalism is, or what it rests on, are two fundamental pillars. The United States as the core security guarantor of the Western alliance, and that started in the Cold War, but has come into the post-Cold War period, where the Americans are, in fact, the world's policemen. And so they adjudicate, usually with force, and there's a whole sidebar about how adjudicating by force is not a good idea. In fact, it violates the international liberal principles of using courts and other institutions, other than the military. But the Americans nevertheless did that. But they were the core of the Western-centric security system. I'll leave aside, the Chinese and the Russians for the time being. Although, to be honest with you, the Chinese have participated in the liberal international order, and weirdly enough, they're right now the biggest champions of the liberal international order. But they see what's coming.
The tiger economy is something quite different to perhaps those that followed the structures of the one-party communist system, and
I mean,
so we know that, and even Vietnam's response economically and demographically to the consequences of the Vietnam War is the tiger economies type of approach, although separate to China.
Yeah, and you and I, again, we do have perspective with our distance. We got to give up on this term communism. Not you personally now, but we just got to shut up about that stuff. What you have in China,
you're talking about the overuse and flag raising of the word inside other countries. Yeah,
these countries like Vietnam, North Korea, China, but not just them that are left-leaning or former Stalinists or former Maoists. They're one-party authoritarian state capitalist systems. They're, communism is a boogie boy for the right wing, which yells "commie" anytime it sees something that talks about egalitarianism or distribution. Now, one pillar of the liberal international system is the U.S. security guarantee. The other one is the U.S. as the core of the international system of trade. in part using its security guarantee to guarantee freedom of navigation. The free trade regime is guaranteed by the United States. It has always wanted to have a 600 ship navy. It's not quite there, but from time to time it has gotten up to 600 ships. Why? Not because he needs them for the defense of the United States. It's to protect the sea lanes of communication through which most of the world's trade travels. So the Americans were the two pillars of the entire system in practice. Now, the US was also the main beneficiary of both of these pillars. It benefited the most. It's what made the United States the hegemon, because it was the core of both security and trade. And so not only was it the guarantor, but it was the beneficiary. And then, as a little minor aside, if you will, an international relations mini-me, Israel emerged within that system as the greatest beneficiary outside of the United States. Why? Because Israel has been protected for over 5 decades by the Western international order. Had there not been that order and its system of institutions that systematically looked the other way at the increasingly egregious violations of international norms by the Israelis, they wouldn't be around. If the global South had risen, let's just think of where the sympathies are in places like Africa.
What you're talking about is the corruption of the use of veto at the United Nations Security Council by way of the United States as a permanent member, and that tool being used to basically prevent and censor, if you like. And I think the word prevent, I mean from the point of view of recourse to the law, international law or whatever, and the censor to try and censor some sort of outcome on those grounds. We see it even to today in an extreme way. More than perhaps we envisaged.
Among many other things. I mean, let's face it, the selling of weapons to the Israelis, in spite of all the condemnations. The West speaks out of both sides of its mouth. It's what the American indigenous peoples said, they have a snake's tongue. The white man has a snake's tongue. The West treats Israel, it condemns it, but then it trades. It receives no effective punishment. My point is that's over. And the reason it's over is because, A, the United States security guarantee, it turns out, is a bit of a paper tiger. I'll give you an example because it goes right to this current conflict. The Saudi Arabians, the UAE, the Qataris, the Kuwaitis, they all have bilateral defense agreements with the United States in which the United States explicitly promised to shield them from Iranian retribution should there any war break out between the United States and the Iranians. And for a long time, people believed that myth. But it turns out that so-called security umbrella over these countries has a bullseye on it. And that bullseye attracts Iranian missiles. So now, because all of these countries have provided forward bases to the United States, and you have to realize how exceptional it is to have infidel invader forces on the holy lands of Saudi Arabia. I mean, that's, it's pretty intense. The Saudis have tried to hide it, but they no longer can. The Iranians have targeted those American bases with some success, as well as civilian infrastructure, because these countries are aiding the United States and Israel in their war of aggression against Iran. They're not attacking Jordan. They're not attacking the Egyptians. They're going after the countries that are actively conspiring with the United States and Israel to destroy Iran. So the security guarantee is over. In fact, being that closely allied to the United States makes you a target. And if I was Taiwanese, I'd be reconsidering the whole deal, to be honest with you. Now,
there may be something in that, because we know the opposition leader in Taiwan has spent some time over in the People's Republic, basically trying to establish some sort of relationships and forward momentum on that very issue, hasn't she? So that's an interesting concept.
Here's the other side, and this is where it gets even more interesting. That's why the subject is fascinating. So on the security side, the United States, I mean, this is the own goal of own goals. The United States has basically shown itself to be a paper tiger, or unable to deliver on its security promises to its closest regional allies in a strategic sector known as the Middle East. Now, what about trade? Well, it started with the United States imposing tariffs. The system of trade is supposed to be reciprocal open markets, that whole free market palaver. Mm. And Trump comes in and starts imposing tariffs willy-nilly for reasons that are not always economic.
Now, they're used as a punitive measure to punish, to enforce compliance. And that's something that we haven't really seen. The ideas of tariffs when the tariff regime was around, I'm sure you in particular could do a whole episode on that. A historical observation, they weren't used necessarily as punitive tools of control. So it's something quite different, isn't it?
Yeah, he's weaponized tariffs. But again, weaponization of tariffs per se is not a bad thing if you're getting cheated by the other side. So you say, fine, we're going to raise our tariffs on you because you guys are doing intellectual property theft, or whatever the transgression.
But now we see them being applied to countries in the in the European Union when they're not doing what Trump, for example, is insisting they do. And it may or may not be relating to trade. So they're just absolutely destroying those kind of bedrock relationships that the United States has prospered from in an economic and trade sense.
You're absolutely correct. Now, let's face it. He's punishing Europe because he doesn't like the fact that they don't spend more money on NATO and they don't come to his rescue. He punishes Latin American countries because they don't favor his political allies. He threw tariffs on Brazil because they put Jair Bolsonaro in jail for sedition, something that was very obvious, that he had, led it and orchestrated this attempt. It was the Brazilian version of January 6th. They tried to overthrow the election in which Bolsonaro was voted out. Tried a violent revolt in Brasilia. Anyway, they failed, and he's in jail now. But the United States, because Bolsonaro was an ally of Trump, imposed 100% tariffs on Brazilian coffee. So it's totally punitive. One might argue it's irrational, but it's overtly political. And that's exactly what the system of free trade was designed to prevent. You had universal rules, and one of them was freedom of navigation. That is, the U.S., again, would guarantee that you can drive your boats wherever you want, and the U.S. would come in and intervene if the littoral states, so the states, around the waterway you're trying to get through, resisted in one way or another.
There's an irony in this part. There's just, before we tag that in, I can see what you're constructing, and it's excellent. There's an irony in the transactional elements of the Trump administration. They observed clearly that Iran was positioning to have transaction benefit from allowing shipping to pass the Strait of Hormuz. So you then immediately saw Trump obviously thinking, well, that's a great idea, but we're controlling that waterway. We will click that ticket, thank you very much, and positioning to do so. So I just wanted to add in, this wonderful thing which you're weaving here of this whole framework, this insight into the structures of what you are seeing with the materialization or the application of that on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, I just wanted to jab that one back in there too. Not that, Yeah, yeah.
Oh, and we're just scratching the tip of the iceberg here because the Iranians suckered the Americans in. Now, remember, we've already talked about the strategic culture in Iran. Again, very patient, thinking 3 or 4 moves ahead. The Americans are instant gratification, technology driven. In a contest between those two strategic cultures, I tend to bet on the side of the patient one. And the Iranians, basically, this is why I find absolutely delicious. They use capitalism as a major weapon, and it works this way. It turns out the Iranians have proven in the past, in the 1980s in particular, that they will put mines into the Straits of Hormuz and Persian Gulf. They will damage civilian vessels. They blew a hole in the largest super tanker of the time in 1988 while Reagan was president, forcing it to return to port to make their point that the Iran and the United States were arguing about something different. So they just made the point that they had the ability with one mine to bring things to a screeching halt. And one of the funny aspects of this, it wasn't funny to the sailors involved, is that when the Americans rushed 3 destroyers out there to do mine sweeping, they had not trained hardly at all in mine sweeping. And so they wound up going single file behind the supertanker as if they were going behind an icebreaker in order to avoid the mines that they were supposedly out there sweeping for. It was a debacle. Well, the U.S., it turns out, the Navy has not really improved its anti-mining or its counter-mining capabilities. So we're back to square one with the mining business. Now, here's where Iran uses capitalism well. Iran understands a impeccable but simple logic. So long as they demonstrate that they can fire 1 missile a week at a ship in the Persian Gulf or the Straits, then the insurance industry will do their work for them. The insurance industry will not insure any boats if the Iranians can still show that they can wipe them out from the land. So right now, you can say the straits are open, the straits are not open, you can say whatever. But until Iran tells the insurance community that it's good to start insuring ships again, they will not. And so the costs have become prohibitive. You want to run that gauntlet, you're going to pay for it twice. One to the insurance companies up front, and then you're going to pay it to the Iranians or whoever. Now it gets even better because the Iranians didn't do a blockade. We mentioned this last week. They imposed a toll system where ships that wanted to transit and they were not involved, they were not flagged by hostile states. So, not Israeli ships or US ships or ships from the Arab oligarchies. They weren't allowed, but anybody else who wanted to come and go through the straits, they diverted eastwards to a narrow shipping lane between 2 small islands that are south of the big island of Karg, where the oil refineries are. Mm. And they imposed an electronic toll booth where you call up the Iranian Navy, you agree to pay the toll, which I understand was $2 million a boat. Yep. And then they give you an electronic password. And when you come through the toll gate, you issue that password electronically, and the Iranian Navy and its shore forces hear that, know that you're good to go, and they let you go. And so they were raking in some money because, quite frankly, dozens of ships started diverting.
That's there, what Trump noticed, didn't he? Well, I think at the point of last episode, we were kind of thinking Trump's a transactionalist. He'll probably respect that in some way. He's respected it also and wanted a slice of that to push them out of the road, and they go in. Basically, in some ways, it's like piracies of the high seas, from all accounts. In some ways, the free passage is not there.
Yeah, but that's assuming that you believe in the freedom of navigation and the free market stuff, but that's just the construct.
Yeah.
Okay, that's just, that's the liberal international order that the West invented.
But so this is another illustration of how far away that is now from convention, from precedence, from consequence and records.
I'm going to offer you a bunch of challenges to show you why it's over. So what happens? They institute this toll system. And I'll just get this out of the way right away. They don't need to run naval ships to enforce the so-called blockade or the tolls. They've got enough land assets that can reach out into the middle of the Persian Gulf and damage things. You see, in the old days, you needed to run a boat out there to intercept a ship. In our era, land-based shore batteries have cruise missiles. And so they can easily eliminate ships transiting choke points. They have underwater drones, so they can act as mini submarines. So the technologies have now overcome the principle. Well, what happens? 2 lessons are learned. One is completely wrong, and that's Trump decides, okay, then we're going to double down on the Iranian blockade, and we're going to blockade anybody coming and going to Iranian ports and taking their oil, but other goods as well. Well, guess what? 80% of the maritime traffic to and from Iranian ports comes from the People's Republic of China. The Chinese are not happy with this American selective blockade. So they've already sent out a diplomatic note to the Americans protesting. But what's next? They start sending warships to escort their commercial vessels to and from. What are the Yanks going to do? I personally think they won't do anything. They're not going to challenge the Chinese. Again, paper tiger stuff. On top of that, Oman, which controls the western shores of the strait, has said, hey, those tolls aren't a bad idea. Why don't we divert?
Well, Iran, from my understanding, agreed to split the benefits with Oman on the basis that it's had this relationship going for the Strait of Hormuz going back a long time. Yes.
And so, it's exquisite. Okay. So, they are playing chess and Trump is playing checkers. Now it gets better than that, because on the one hand, if you look at the Suez Canal, if you look at the Panama Canal, they already charge tolls on all vessels coming through. Now, they are waterways that have been cut through the sovereign territory of a nation state. So you could say, well, yeah, they're doing tolls because you're going through their inland waters. True. But that doesn't mean that other narrow waterways, let's think, the Bosphorus Strait, the Straits of Malacca, other narrow, and the other key point of this choke point theory is the waters are also shallow. It's not just the width of the waterway, but it's the depth of the waterway that matters. Well, the Bosphorus, in the Bosphorus, Istanbul is on both sides of that strait. And it's the Turks who, just out of politeness, have labeled it an international waterway. They could close that thing yesterday.
And I know those that follow history in our audience will be saying, that's why it was significantly and strategically important in World War I. That's why.
Absolutely.
Turkey was invaded by British, Australian, New Zealand forces in a failed attempt to get to that point, to control.
Yeah.
And why? Because it has access to the Black Sea,
Exactly.
Caspian oil fields, etc., etc.
Yeah. So, and so what's happened is, I mean, I can envision a situation where the Singaporeans, the Malaysians, and the Indonesians decide to impose a toll system in the Malaccan Straits. And they divvy up the tolls. And that allows them to maintain the straits via dredging and other things. I mean, I can see the rationales being developed to say, you know what, this free navigation stuff, it doesn't work for us. And so we're going to cooperate. See, there's another polycentric move.
Yep.
And minilateral, as you and I have talked about, minilateralism in the past, they get together and they go, no offense to anybody, but these are our waterways. We get along, so we're going to use our navies to make sure that we get the toll, and the toll will improve the lives of our people. We'll take the tolls and use them on infrastructure. Think about the other waterways. Right now, we have the opening of the Northern Passage in the Arctic Ocean thanks to climate change. There's a mad scramble on to get up there and claim stakes. The Russians are already there. The Americans have photographed, using a submarine, a Russian flag on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, saying this is Russian territory. They're staking claims. You can imagine that the Bering Straits between Russia and the United States, because that's the side on the eastern side is American controlled, not Canadian. But the fact is, any place where there is a choke point in a waterway, we now have the technological capability to close it off, but not necessarily using maritime platforms. We can do it from the shore. Just like, again, the Iranians, one missile a week pointed at a tanker in the Persian Gulf, the insurance companies say no. So because the insurance companies say no, it is very possible that they will attempt to reach a deal with countries, littoral countries that overlook these choke points, and cut a contract in which a toll is fixed by an international commission and people pay it, and it's the price of doing business. That's where we appear to be headed.
But I think, like David Moran has just added a comment there. Think tolls on Panama and Suez canals. With respect to Panama, it starts to fall into place, doesn't it? With respect to Trump talking up the opportunity, perhaps, to control, if not take full control of Panama, in particular with the canal going through there. He raised that very early in this particular term, the term 2.
Yeah, he was. But remember, Trump is not a smart man. Trump, he was more concerned about the fact that Chinese shipping companies controlled the container terminals on either side of the Panama Canal. Now, David may have missed that I talked about the tolls on canals earlier in this conversation. But yeah, I recognize, but canals are different than straits. But the principle, I believe, can be expanded to apply to straits. Maybe not the Straits of Gibraltar, too wide, too deep, possibly. But again, we have the technological capability to shut them down in a measure we didn't have even 30 years ago.
So with Gibraltar, you'd have to have the Brits buying in on the whole transactionalist approach to this destruction of the old international order, and it hasn't quite got there yet, but I'm talking about the British territory and the Gibraltar. All of these things are lining up, and I suppose it leaves me to kind of think without being able to land on the answer. So those questions there are, we can see the shape of this. Has it passed tipping point? Has it passed that Rubicon where there's no going back? And at what point, if we haven't already, do we say that's gone, this is it?
Well, we have to see the conclusion of the war. But again, the war, strategically speaking, has been won by the Iranians because they've made their point that the waterway is no longer safe. See, you can do ceasefires, but until there's a comprehensive agreement to refuse to use force to close the straits, it's now an open threat. And let's not just focus on the Iranians. Everybody has learned a lesson from this. Now, I didn't say one thing earlier, but again, this is why the tipping point has been reached. When the Iranians charge their tolls on ships coming and going to other countries that are on the coasts of the Persian Gulf, they charge in yuan, that is the Chinese currency, or crypto. And that undermines the US dollar as the default currency for global trade.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
So
why
yeah.
the US has blundered in to a situation where its currency is being undermined. There had already been amongst the BRIC countries a move to start exchanging trades, goods and services in their own currencies. And lo and behold, Brazil and China now trade in their respective currencies. They
Oh,
fix an optimal price for the
yeah.
exchange, and
Yeah.
then they sell the goods and they review that price periodically. That means that the US dollar could well lose its status as the global default currency for trade. If
And
that
you think
happens,
about it, you think, yeah, I get it. You think about it in practice now. You don't need to use the United States as the default currency in some ways. Yes, it's anchored in from the point of view of all of the other currencies adjusting to it in value or otherwise. But if you want to trade with New Zealand dollars and you want to secure transaction with entities in Australia dollars or New Zealand dollars can work just as well. So at a smaller level, as opposed to the backbone, the fabric of the international currency markets, you can see that you can avoid. And that's an interesting kind of thing in a sense. Although the realities are still that if money is coming in via export, generally to nations and economies all over the world, it comes in usually via the United States. But what you're saying is that may have been a pattern or behaviours or convenience as opposed to anything else. And anything that avoids that on a massive industrial scale or a territorial economic scale can quickly undermine the values of the United States dollar domestically inside the United States significantly, very quickly, just like in World War II, how counterfeit was used as a weapon of currency war against enemies by all sides. So it's an interesting concept, isn't it? And with the rise of decentralized trading or payments of trading, that has taken a huge whack, we've got to say, in the last 6 months. But the mechanisms are there, and there looks to be adjustments for just as a very quick side tangent, where the US dollar token and crypto, the stable coins that was anchored to the United States dollar, there's always been the digital USDC, and that has been smaller by way of trade, but suddenly has been rising very quickly because some of the new technologies of decentralized trading have anchored in preference on that particular one, the USDC. So there is certainly patterns, it seems, when you even look at that, of preparing for what you're talking about. That's where I'm landing on that.
yeah, and you put your finger on it, Selwyn. The fact that you and I and many other people are actively talking about shifting the terms of exchange off of the dollar
Yeah.
into anything else. I mean, you mentioned Australia, New Zealand trade. The fact that we're even thinking that way is proof that the old order is dying. Now, the U.S. has made this bet in part when it removed itself from the gold standard in the early 70s, then the dollar became, quite frankly, a commodity just like any other one. There wasn't anything special about it. And unfortunately, the way the markets reacted to the freeing of the dollar was to purchase US debt. But in the measure that these decentralized markets move to exchanges and other currencies and what have you, the US dollar is going to depreciate rather dramatically. And let's
And
just say that.
perhaps some in the United States don't realize that major economies like the People's Republic of China and many others have stockpiled up United States currencies to the point where they can manipulate the strength or weaknesses at their leisure. So that's something to bear in mind too. And when you've got forces like Trump's economic handling of the United States economy, shall we say, and perhaps eroding into the independence of some of those institutions like the Fed, you start to actually realize that, it's gone past. And this might be another program, but one of the questions that come out of that is, what can the response be to this? Is it compliance to a new order that basically evolves like a genesis, if you like? Is there pushback coming? Is there not? Is there this reshaping? Is it a good thing? We touched on some of the merits of it in some ways in the last episode. Maybe we pick up that again at a later stage and just see some, the cost benefits, pitfalls, strengths, weaknesses, that type of thing of what is happening as we move into it. Back to you, Paul, because I like this this idea and this construct that you're building up, that it's one of realism, and I think I can just get a sense of where it's heading.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is this: when you have the core pillars of the liberal international system, if you will, collapsed from within, because this is the supreme irony. The main beneficiary is the one who's doing the destruction. It's the folly of the MAGA administration that no one in the White House seems to have read much about history. Obviously, for all their talk, doesn't know a lot about economic theory and trade. And so the ones who, could continue to benefit from the old status quo are destroying it. And as I said, as a sidebar, they're going to bring down Israel as well, because Israel, without the United States, is no longer capable of doing the things it's now doing. So what happens next? Now, I told you, the move to the illiberal order, okay? So if liberalism is defined by free markets and free societies, so to speak, then whatever's coming is not going to be that. And I use the word illiberal, and in spite of the hard alliteration, is because I learned the word when it came up with reference to democracy. There's a concept known as illiberal democracy. And it's basically governments that are elected freely but then hardened. Viktor Orban in Hungary was a classic example of that. And fortunately, now he's been out.
Lost his elections, yeah.
Thank goodness, but it took a long time. I was in power for 16 years, and he had been in power in the late 1990s. But so there are types of democracies that are not as much about freedom of speech, association as you might think. There's, it's called, the literature is called variety of democracy, all these different types. Now, I'm proposing the word not as an exercise in conceptual stretching, but as you know, is bad. Conceptual transfer is good. Stretching, now you're trying to pull it into places. But I think in this one, it's
square peg in a round hole type of thing. It doesn't.
And that's unfortunately, that's a methodological and analytic flaw that many policymakers and academics unfortunately engage in. In this case, I think, no, the transfer is okay, because all you're saying is that what comes next will not be the liberal international order defined as free markets and free society. Like, okay. Now, what I find interesting is that right now, the country that is pushing the hardest for keeping some of the liberal institutions, like the World Bank, for example, is the People's Republic of China. They want some of those institutions to remain, but have more of a global South flavor. And I agree with them. You know, the global South, this is its moment. It needs to be represented equally in the international organization hierarchy. But the Chinese and others have said, you know, some of these international or liberal institutions are surplus to purposes. We no longer need them. And that gets a little dicey because most of the security apparatus in the West is designed to preserve a pro Western international status quo. So to
Before
keep
we
the
move
China.
into that, I'm sorry to interject on this because I
Yeah,
can
no,
get
no.
the sense of the flow, but there is something that comes up, and David Mooring has put the question here: can you define the usage of the word liberal in terms of neoliberalism? So getting back to those underneath the current practice of free trade relationships, and even polycentrism may have some sort of relevance to this as well.
Okay, well, so I'll briefly answer David. David, you're talking to a University of Chicago grad who took Milton Friedman's macro and micro sequence in economics. Neoliberalism just means, so the liberal comes from Ricardian principles, Adam Smith, all that jazz. That's all it means. It means, again, free markets. The neo it's a revised new version that emerged in the 1980s. But the Friedmanite version, which was used here, is basically finance capital is the highest form of capitalism on a global level. So finance capitalists should lead national investment decision making. Where the finance people want to put their money is where countries should follow. Now, there's a myriad of reasons why that's not a good idea. But third rate minds, like many of those in the New Zealand government, continue to spout the term neoliberalism as if it had some credibility. In places like Latin America, it's a dirty word. Okay, it was discredited 20 years ago, and yet here in little old provincial New Zealand, we're still squawking about neoliberalism.
And some of the explanations why it may still be anchored in is because New Zealand obviously was, at very least, a model of testing out the theory. But what it did was breed out zealots that have influenced others that have entered into the political elite to continue this experiment long before even post-COVID, where it was obviously rendered totally irrelevant from the point of view of being able to cope with major shocks and like a epidemic of such proportions has on one's economies and its peoples. So what was interesting in that time, what I found, Paul, just to put the, and in some ways it underscores what you're saying, is the regression in some ways of major economies around the world in the COVID period to revert back to Keynesian economics to distribute from the point of view of absolute necessity to their peoples. And obviously there were mistakes made in New Zealand's case of distributing centrally to employers so that they would then pass on to employees as a means of conduit between central government and the peoples. And maybe in hindsight, people would argue that bodies like Inland Revenue or the IRS have a direct relationship with such populations, individuals and entities, and that would be the better route that's taken. But it's not lost, I think, that when times demand it, that neoliberalism is put to bed and is seen as totally ineffective. And I think that's another part of the argument that you're putting there.
Yeah, and you made a very good point. I mean, a lot of foreigners will say, "Oh, New Zealand's a nation of sheep." No, we're a nation of laboratory rats. People come here and experiment on us, and if our eyes don't turn pink and we flop upside down, then they think the experiment worked. You're absolutely
There's
right,
a bit
though.
of flopping upside down and having the belly rubbed, I'd say.
Yeah, well, we're just lab rats, looking for a piece of cheese, running around on the little roulette thing, because New Zealand's not calling the shots. And the proof of that is that the response to the COVID, and I'm going to come back to international trade this way, is enlightened countries returned to variations of welfare statism, not pure Keynesianism, although you were onto it, but variations of welfare statism. And as a book in the 1980s was titled, "Sometimes You Got to Bring the State Back In." And pandemic mitigation is definitely one of those times. So, were there flaws in the process? Yes. Were mistakes made? Yes. But New Zealand has finally one policy thing that it can claim itself to be world class in, and that was the pandemic response. And yet, these so-called neoliberal types are moaning about it and saying, "Oh, you infringed on our liberties," and anyway, you just feel
so David will be very pleased that we've dedicated quite a significant amount of this episode to that very simple question of defining, liberalism and with neoliberalism.
Well, remember, yeah, but remember that I'm a former academic. I'm married to a current academic, and she gets these sort of questions all the time. It drives her nuts. And actually, interestingly, my father-in-law of all people was a Labor Party activist type, who I normally don't get into intellectual stuff with. He actually said a very interesting thing about neoliberalism, because I was complaining to him more or less about how I'm complaining now. And he goes, "The trouble with neoliberalism is that it's become a social ideology. It's all about individualism. It's all about yourself. Stuff everybody else. You're going to get yours. And if you got to step on people to get yours, that's neoliberalism. I'm doing it."
And for those in the United States, they'll be thinking, well, isn't that, that individualism, that's got its merits, et cetera, et cetera. What Paul's alluding to there within the New Zealand culture, the colloquial term of giving a fair go was embedded into New Zealand society as in many respects. There's attempts at egalitarianism as a primary part of the New Zealand culture of exchange was very, very embedded in. The neoliberalism experiment, we can see the consequences in the generations that have risen post that, where they've lost that because they never experienced it in their own right. And they saw the hard-edged consequence of it, perhaps I would argue very strongly, where hardship, degradation and alienation has occurred. So we're back into that kind of pattern society-wise. I really respect what your father-in-law was saying there, because he's one who was obviously observing prior to and observing the rise of the neoliberal experiment in New Zealand, and he has been able to witness the consequences of it at society level. That's a pretty powerful part to be.
Yeah, no, he was right. I mean, let's face it. You can be individualistic and not climb over the bodies of other people to achieve something in life. You can have capitalism, but you don't need feral capitalism. And unfortunately, neoliberalism opened the doors. Remember the original concept I just mentioned. They say that finance capital is the leading edge of capitalism, hence you follow them to wherever they want to go. Nowadays, finance capital has been replaced by techno-capital, run by guys like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. Do you really, really want to follow those guys on social policy? On matters of humanitarian assistance? Do we
I think
really, really?
the response to that reality is one where arguments, debates, and policies must start to address a robot tax where robots replace the full-time equivalents or part-time equivalents of human beings. And then what do you do with that? And also these governments that are giving the tech bros a real free hands up with development. The relationship between government procurement and R&D development must have some sort of benefit for governments. It must start to develop policies and arguments that are in favour of joint venture relationships with these entities. If you have an entity that is operating traditionally in a taxation jurisdiction, in the past it's been human and it has been business. Business is taxed as an entity, just like humans are, or arguably with different policy sets. But the realities are they're considered an entity just like a human. I think that those types of debates really must happen very, very quickly now and start to actually do that. What do you do with that revenue? You can start to distribute by UBI, universal basic incomes, based on persons, citizens, and permanent residencies. But those are big arguments, but those are really important when you start to actually look at where we are now, how it got there, and the dangers of the rise of the techno economies that are benefit from both private and public, but are a side of it from the point of view of governance and consequence.
Yeah, and all of this is going to be resolved in the illiberal international order, not by the liberal international order. Now, to circle back to the international system, the deal is that domestically, the most successful countries dealt with the pandemic using welfare statist approaches, based on Keynesianism. However, in the international system of trade and exchange, even though there were modifications towards decentralization of production, all of that friendism and regionalism, there sort of was varieties of capital type changes. The basic system of trade did not change. And so the pandemic itself was not enough to change the international trade system or order guaranteed by the United States. But this war has. And so the double blows of the pandemic first, which showed structural weaknesses in the global system of trade and exchange, followed by a war in which the vulnerabilities of particularly maritime traffic, and most of the world's goods and services travel by sea, have now basically represented the death knell of the liberal international order when it comes to trade. All again, thanks to the United States. So we're moving now into the unknown when it comes to how our trade networks will reconfigure once the insurers decide it's safe to do so. And we already know, for example, the Russians have put major investment into running pipelines out to Vladivostok so they don't have to do any overland pipes on any foreign country. They go straight from west to east on Russian soil, and then they sell their oil and natural gas out of Vladivostok. That's one response. The Saudis have built a pipeline to the Red Sea, even though it was easier for them to stay on their eastern flanks. But they realize it's over. That toll booth is going to remain. So they're going over to the Red Sea, and they'll pay the tolls going north through the Suez Canal. But the Iranians, of course, have now said, oh, by the way, we have missiles that reach the Red Sea. And so we may block that too. My point is, I actually saw something yesterday that it made me cringe. A reputable university in New Zealand that I shall not mention has something called its annual foreign policy school that is held in midwinter in the city where this university is located. And this year's theme is the liberal international order and New Zealand's role in it. And I'm like, did you guys fall asleep at the bar? Are you serious? In the middle of this war, because it won't be over by midwinter New Zealand time, you're talking about the liberal order and New Zealand's role in it. What role? It turns out we bark a lot, but we don't do anything. And the order itself is under siege. And in fact, to my mind, it's dead. So they're putting this big international conference together. And I know the reason why. The leading person who at this university is a liberal internationalist himself. He's a full professor guy, very, very famous in New Zealand. And he's a total liberal internationalist. So he doesn't want to give it up. And instead, he's trying to prop it up. And I'm like, dude, you got a reality check, man. It's over. But that's probably why I don't get invited to these things. But it'll be interesting to see how they reconcile the theme of the 3-day conference with the reality of what's going on around them. Now, again, I don't have a crystal ball to tell you.
What would be interesting to see coming out of that, because there will be some that listen to this episode in there, it would be very interesting to see whether or not they pick up the ideas of polycentrism. And also from the point of view of reform. If a small country like New Zealand gets over its current occupiers of its central government, belief in sycophancy, in my argument, and actually look at New Zealand with a voice relating to idealism and reform, then some of those bodies may be able to adjust that are relevant. And also to wake up to the fact that New Zealand has been exercising itself in polycentric ways relating to its trade relationships for many, many decades. And so it's an interesting kind of part there that I wonder what they will do about it. If it is regressive from the point of view of trying to get things back, once again, it's, I think your phrase, and it's used quite a lot, of putting the genie back in the bottle. So picking up where we are, what are the relationships with the global south? What merits are there? What relevance does authoritarianism within these various jurisdictions have on the relationships? And even from the point of view of rapprochement, what influences do they have? So it would be an interesting kind of thing to see where things move. One can't just take, obviously, and one would argue that this is reality, a conservative approach that is stamped in time on a timeline such as what we've been examining here, that things have changed. They're outside the scope of a small country like New Zealand. But what is the scope of a country like New Zealand? And perhaps it rests on that question.
Yeah, well, I certainly don't see us punching above our weight anytime soon. But getting back to the general theme, let me point this out. It's still forming in my mind, but I subscribe to the following view. Embedded in polycentrism, right? So we went through a period of multipolarity. Let's just say multipolarity is divided by the preeminence of nation states, great powers, okay? Polycentrism is different because it involves non-state actors. So technology giants, they've got they certainly have, the GDPs of, even big, large states.
Absolutely.
But I subscribe to the view that what's emerging, and it's a bit of a bridge between the North and South, it's a bit of everything, are a balance of power between petropoles, which are extractive economies, so critical minerals, let's think of that, as well as petroleum. But they need advanced technologies to increase the efficiencies of their extractive enterprises. So petropoles, and then technopoles, which are very advanced technologies, but which need more primitive infrastructure sustenance in order to continue. For example, one of the big arguments in local governance in the United States are these large data centers
Mm.
because they suck up water. I'm partial to the desert, given my life in Arizona. Um, the general view is that if data centers using solar panels and whatnot, although it seems ideal for a place like Arizona that gets 360 days of sunlight a year, uh, the water drain will be such it will absolutely dry up that state within a decade. And so it's environmentally, it's prohibitive. But of course, the tech bros are pushing it. So they need that primitive, they need solar, they need water for their advanced technologies. So you've got technopoles and then you've got petropoles. And the question is, how do you find an equilibrium? Be the interests of the former and the interests of the latter. And those poles will be distributed in a polycentric way. So they can be in small states, one or the other. Right now, the best example are the Arab oligarchies. Places like the UAE and Qatar are becoming major data centers. They don't really care about their people 20 years from now. They're fascinated with very crude notions of modernity. I say crude because it's sort of the notion of Elon Musk or Thiel.
Yeah, it looks like we're back online, Paul. Sorry to the audience, we had a bit of an outage there, a significant one, and we dropped off. No doubt you all noticed that, and I can see in the questions there that that's the case. Paul, we can pick up, if you like, where we were with a bit of a wrap up, really, wasn't it, with respect to our primary discussion today. I'll just hand it back to you for that.
Yeah, so we were finishing up basically by saying that we know a few things for certain, and that is that the liberal international order, defined as a system of free markets coupled with free societies, is pretty much over and done with. That the next system will be illiberal, but only in the sense that it is not liberal. So it may be less focused on democracy. It may be less about free markets than guaranteed markets or protected markets. Obviously, tariffs remains as a sticking point, but I think it'll be resolved in a hybrid fashion. Again, I don't have a crystal ball for all of this, but I do know that this war, following so soon after the pandemic, is delivered a double fatal blow to the international liberal order. And so now the question is, what comes next? I think we got cut off when I was finishing up with multipolarity leading to polycentrism, leading to balance of power be petropole need raw materials and raw material producing economies that need technologies in order to impose efficiencies in production. And the Arab states represent an example of this. They're going very much into hybrid economies, which try to mix both. And I know that we lost the signal when I was talking about China trying to do both from within. That has developed its own internal domestic petropoles and technopoles and use its size and natural resource base to fuel both. So the new order is coming. China may or may not be uh, the centerpiece of that new order. It looks like it will be because the Chinese leadership, in spite of their many flaws, have a degree of foresight that clearly the Trump administration does not have. And the question then will be will we see more conflict? That this war will not end the transitional moment, conflict as the system's regulator period, but that in fact it'll continue in, let's say, the ongoing wars in Ukraine, perhaps continued strife between Pakistan and India. There's a number of flashpoints where conflict could emerge as people try to, nation states try to, adjust their seats at the table of the new order. And that's, all beyond my comprehension. But at least for our listeners, the issue is let's disabuse ourselves of the notion that things are going to stay more or less the same and the international status quo is going to remain, by and large, attacked with the U.S. as the center of it in the foreseeable future. That much I'm pretty confident that I can say it's over. That the U.S. is now clearly showing it's in decline and it's behaving in a way that is consistent with empires in decline from the leadership on down. So um, we shall see, but I am certainly glad. As I said to a friend of mine when I was lifeguarding years ago, when the big nuclear war comes, I'll be sitting on the beach in New Zealand, and the only thing it'll have an impact on me is it'll be a big green glow on the northern horizon because we're not even in the downwind tail of any nuclear strikes in the northern hemisphere. So we'll get to watch it, enjoy the ultimate green flash over the horizon, and then hope for a better day for the southern hemisphere the next morning.
Hopefully it doesn't get to that. It was bad enough when the nuclear testing in the Pacific was a frequent, atmospheric testing was a frequent phenomenon, and people in Auckland City looked out to the eastern Pacific, and what they saw was something that made some think that Armageddon had occurred. So let's not ponder that too much, let alone what it was like for Christmas Island, Marshall Islands, Mururoa Atoll, and other jurisdictions across the blue continent. On that note, Paul, let's say thank you to the audience. Thank you very much for the investment of your time. We much appreciate that. And if you have got to this point and you found it was valuable to you, please subscribe to it, the episode, to the podcast, A View from Afar, on YouTube. There you will be able to get notifications on when we're next occurring, and hopefully we get to see you and interact with you again. Thanks too to David Mooring, who was very interactive in this episode, and we much appreciate that from Paul and I both. Ka kite anō, and we'll see you again in about a month's time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.